The signal came from a dead zone. Not dead in the poetic sense. Dead in the very real, very legal sense. That no ship was supposed to be there, no route passed through it, and no rescue service covered it. The outer reach had a dozen corridors. Like this one. Broken rocks, old radiation, and the kind of silence that made experienced pilots nervous. Rail Dorn was not a nervous pilot. He was, however, a practical one. He had been hauling grain supplements and machine parts across the outer reach for 11 years, and the one rule he had never broken was, do not stop for signals in dead zones. Nothing good waited in dead zones. He stopped anyway. Later, when people asked him why, he would shrug and say he heard something in the signal that did not sound like a malfunction. He could not explain it better than that. The tone of it bothered him. That was all. The ship he found was a Veth diplomatic courier, registry markings still visible on the hull despite the burn scoring. The reactor had gone. 3 of the 4 hull sections were open to space. Whatever had hit it hard and fast, and whoever had done it was long gone. Rail matched velocity, extended the docking arm, and turned to his engineer. Bryn did not look up from her console. She had been with him for 6 years. She knew when he had already made a decision. How bad, she asked. Very, he said. Veth ship. Diplomatic courier. She looked up then. Rail. I know. Those are Veth. You understand that. The Veth. I know what the Veth are, Bryn. She stared at him for a moment, then turned back to her console and started running pressure checks on the docking collar. She did not agree. She also did not stop him. That was the arrangement they had. The Veth were one of 3 species in the known galaxy classified under the Galactic Council's extreme hazard designation. The rating had nothing to do with their technology or their military, though both were considerable. It had to do with biology. Veth were feline reptilian apex predators evolved on a high-gravity world with 2 competing seasonal predator cycles. Their instincts were not metaphorically sharp. They were literally sharp. An adult Veth in a calm state was already dangerous. A Veth in distress was something that entire council protocols had been written to avoid. The interior of the ship was worse than the exterior suggested. The Veth crew, 4 of them by the count of what remained, had not survived the initial strike. The emergency systems had done what they were built to do. They had sealed the interior pod. Rail found it in the back of the courier, behind a collapsed corridor section that he had to move by hand. The pod was a smooth gray capsule about the size of a large shipping container, with a biometric lock that had already failed over to manual backup. The manual backup was a simple lever. Diplomatic ships were built so that rescue crews of any species could open them. The Veth were proud, but they were not stupid. He opened it. The smell hit him first, warm and sharp, like copper and pine. Then the sound. 2 small voices, very high, very fast, the kind of sound that needed no translation because it was not a language. It was the sound of something small and frightened and trying very hard not to show it. They were in the far corner of the pod. 2 Veth cubs. Rail had never seen a Veth cub before. He had seen adults at a distance, on stations, always in the careful bubble of space that other species kept around them. These were not adults. They were roughly the size of large dogs, covered in scales that caught the light in pale blue and green, with eyes that were enormous and very gold and fixed entirely on him. Their claws were already several centimeters long. Even at this age, the claws were real. Rail crouched down. He did not reach in yet. He just stayed there, at their level, and waited. The smaller one made a sound like a question. He made a low sound back, not a word. Just a tone, the kind of sound he made around frightened animals. The kind that said, I am not moving fast. I am not a threat. I am just here. The larger cub moved first. She came forward 3 steps, then bit his hand. Not a warning bite. A real one. He felt it clearly. Through his glove, and he knew it would bruise. He did not pull back. He did not make a sharp sound. He let the moment pass, and then he turned his hand slowly and offered the back of it, palm down, the way you offered a hand to an animal. You wanted to know you were not going to grab it. The cub bit him again. He stayed still. The second cub, the smaller one, walked forward on its own. climbed into the space under his arm, pressed against his ribs, and went absolutely still, like it had been waiting for something solid to lean against and had decided he was solid enough. The larger one watched this for a moment. Then she climbed into his jacket, curled into the crook of his arm, and closed her enormous gold eyes. Rail sat there on the floor of the ruined pod for a moment. Both Veth cubs settled against him and tried to think of his next problem. Bryn's voice came through the comm unit. "How bad is it?" "There are 2 cubs," he said. A long silence. "Rail," she said. "I know," he said. "You are not bringing them onto this ship." He was already standing up, carefully, both cubs still against his chest. "Rail." "They were scared," he said. "That's all. They were just scared." He carried them back through the corridor, through the docking tube, and onto the steady hand. Bryn was standing in the corridor with her arms crossed and an expression he had seen before, the one that meant she thought he was being an idiot. But she was going to help him anyway. He walked past her toward the bunk room. The larger cub opened one eye, looked at Bryn, and made a sound like a very small, very tired warning. Then she closed the eye again. Bryn uncrossed her arms. "Fine," she said quietly. "Fine." Dural Point was not a beautiful station. It had been built in stages over 90 years by 6 different construction companies, none of which had talked to the others. And the result was a structure that looked less like a space station and more like an argument between architects. Corridors branch where they should not. Docking bays were numbered in for different systems. The gravity was slightly different on every level, and everyone who worked there had a favorite level and refused to explain why. Rail had docked at Dural Point 40 or 50 times over the years. He had never arrived with 2 Veth cubs sleeping in a cargo hammock. He had strung up in the back of the crew quarters, and he had never had to figure out what to say when the docking officer asked him to declare his cargo. He declared them. He used the correct terminology, listed the species, listed the approximate age range as best he could guess, and then waited while the docking officer read it 3 times. "Sir," the docking officer said slowly, "did you say Veth cubs?" 2. Rail confirmed. "Survivors from the diplomatic courier in Corridor 7 Delta. I've already sent the full report." There was a very long pause. "Please remain aboard your vessel." He remained aboard his vessel. Bryn spent that time doing what Bryn did when she was uncomfortable. She cleaned things. The engine manifold had never been so well maintained. Rail sat in the corridor outside the crew quarters and listened to the small sounds from inside. The low rumble that was somewhere between a purr and a growl that the cubs made when they were settled and waited for someone to tell him what happened next. What happened next was Scarath. Rail had never met a Veth merchant before. He understood, intellectually, that they existed. Trade did not care about species classifications. But seeing one move through the narrow corridor of the docking tube was different from knowing about them in theory. Scarath was large, scarred across the left side of his neck in a way that suggested a story, and he moved with the particular kind of ease that very dangerous things move with when they are not currently trying to be dangerous. He stopped in front of Rail. He looked at him for a moment. "I am told," Scarath said, in clipped but clear galactic common, "that you have Veth cubs aboard this vessel." "That's correct," Rail said. "You will give them to me." "I won't," Rail said, in roughly the same tone he had used when Bryn asked him not to stop at the dead zone. Calm. Final. Not aggressive. Just settled. Scarath looked at him with the particular expression of someone who was used to their presence alone being enough. "You do not understand what you are saying." "I understand fine," Rail said. "I don't know you. You don't have any official standing here. When someone with credentials and documentation from the Veth Dominion shows up, we will have a different conversation. Until then, no." Scarath stared at him for a long time. Then, without another word, he turned and walked back down the docking tube. Rail went back inside. He did not know that Scarath had, in the 2 minutes prior to that conversation, walked to the entrance of the cargo bay and looked through the open door at the crew quarters beyond. He did not know what Scarath had seen or what it had done to the merchant's composure, because Scarath did not say anything about it, and his expression, when he left, gave nothing away. What Scarath had seen was this: 2 Veth cubs who had woken up at the sound of an unfamiliar Veth voice, the voice of their own kind, a sound they should have moved toward. Instead they had pressed themselves flat against the hammock, facing the door, and made a low sound that was not a greeting. It was a warning. They were warning the Veth away from the human's ship. 3 other beings on the station had seen this through various observation angles that Rail did not know existed. One of them was a dockworker with a personal recording device. He sent the footage to his sister on a colony station 4 systems away. She sent it to 6 people. Those 6 people sent it further. By the time Yavin arrived, a Galactic Council observer of the small gray Mirran species with large, careful eyes and the nervous energy of someone perpetually aware that they were not at the top of any food chain, the footage had already reached something like 30,000 personal feeds across the Outer Reach network. Yavin introduced herself to Rail in the docking bay with a politeness that suggested she was slightly terrified and was handling it professionally. I am here in an observational capacity, she said. Not enforcement. The Council simply wants to understand the situation. The situation is straightforward, Rail said. I found 2 cubs. I'm taking care of them until someone with proper authority comes to collect them. That's it. Yavin nodded. She glanced toward the crew quarters. From inside came the low rumble purr of cubs in a settled sleep. She looked back at Rail. May I ask, she said carefully, how you are managing to keep them calm? Rail thought about it. I don't raise my voice. I move slowly. I make sure they're fed and warm. He paused. I talk to them. You talk to them, Yavin repeated. Low voice. Doesn't matter what I say. They respond to the tone. Yavin wrote something in her observation log. She wrote it in a way that suggested she was trying to make it sound more scientifically significant than it appeared, because it appeared on the surface like the simplest thing in the world, and she did not know yet what to do with simple. She stayed. She set up a small observer's station near the docking collar with the polite fiction that she was just noting facts. What she was actually doing was watching, very carefully, a human take care of 2 creatures that the galaxy had agreed for 3 centuries were not to be approached. Outside, on 30,000 personal feeds, the galaxy was watching the same thing and asking the same question she was. Not, why aren't they attacking him? Not yet. That question would come later. Right now the question was simpler. Why do they look like they belong there? Nobody told Rail he was under observation. He figured it out on the 2nd day when he noticed that the docking bay external cameras had been repositioned, which was not a thing docking bay cameras were designed to do. He did not say anything about it. He also did not change what he was doing, because what he was doing was not complicated enough to change. He was taking care of 2 cubs. That was the whole of it. He fed them every few hours from a mix of emergency protein rations that he had broken down and reformed into something closer to raw meat in texture, because the standard rations were not going to work, and he knew enough about biology to know that a predator's stomach and a grain supplement were not a good combination. He kept the crew quarters warm. He kept the lights low. He slept sitting up against the wall because lying down meant one of them would sit on his chest and the other would sit on his legs, and he would not be able to move until they decided to move, and they decided to move on their own schedule, not his. On the 3rd day, Bryn stood in the doorway and watched him. For a while, he had the smaller cub, who they had started calling Den in the absence of any other name, sitting in his lap. Den was making a sound, a repeated short sound, and Rail was making a sound back, a low 2-syllable response, and they were doing this back and forth in a rhythm that looked less like babysitting and more like a conversation conducted in a language neither of them had names for yet. Is he copying you? Bryn asked. Sort of, Rail said. I think he's testing to see if I respond the same way each time. Is that normal? I don't know. I don't have a reference. Bryn leaned against the door frame. Rail, you do know that. You've been bitten 6 times. 5, he said. The last one was more of a grip. That is not a meaningful distinction. He shrugged. The larger cub, Sarah, was draped across his shoulders like a very heavy and slightly dangerous scarf. She had been there for most of the morning. He had stopped, noticing the weight. On the 4th day, the behavioral specialist arrived. Her name was Dr. Orvine, and she was Veth. She had the same Billed as Scarath, scaled, careful in her movement, but where? Scarath had moved like something deciding whether to be a threat. Orvine moved like someone who spent most of her time in laboratories and was more interested in what she was looking at than whether it was afraid of her. She was accompanied by two Veth aides who stood at the docking tube and did not come further. Orvine came alone to the door of the crew quarters. She stopped. She looked at Rail. She looked at the cubs. She looked at the way Sara's tail was curled loosely around Rail's forearm while he talked to Den, and she was quiet for a long time. "May I sit?" she asked. Rail moved a toolkit off the nearest surface. She sat. She opened an observation pad but did not look at it. She just watched. After a while she said, "I need to ask you something, and I would like you to answer honestly even if the answer seems obvious." "All right," Rail said. "When you reached into the pod, were you afraid?" He thought about it genuinely, which she noted. He did not dismiss the question. "Not afraid, exactly," he said. "I didn't know what I was going to find. There was something in the signal that bothered me. When I heard them, I was more worried about them than about what they were." Orvine wrote something. "You have been bitten several times." "5 times," he said. Then, catching Bryn's look through the doorway, "possibly 6. And each time, your response was to stay still, to not make it worse. You did not feel the need to establish that you were in control of the situation." He looked at her. "They're cubs. They're scared and they're in a strange place, and their family is dead. What would establishing control do?" Orvine put down her observation pad. "Mr. Dorn," she said slowly, "I study Veth early development. I have been doing it for 20 years. What I am about to tell you is not a compliment, exactly. It is an explanation." She paused. "Veth cubs are raised in a pride structure. Fear triggers aggression. That is biological, and it is not negotiable. When any species other than Veth encounters a Veth cub in distress, the encounter protocols exist because every recorded interaction has gone the same way. The cub escalates. The other party responds to the escalation. The cub escalates further. It ends badly." "That makes sense," Rail said. "You broke the cycle at the first step," Orvine said. "You did not respond to the aggression with fear or counter-aggression. Biologically, from the cub's instinct structure, this reads as one thing only." She paused. "It reads as a pride elder. Someone whose rank is high enough that they do not need to respond. Someone safe." The room was quiet. Den made his small repeated sound. Rail made the low 2-syllable sound back. Den did it again, slightly differently. Rail matched. The difference. Orvine watched this and was very still. "How long have you been doing that?" she asked quietly. "Since yesterday," Rail said. "He started it." She picked up her observation pad again. She wrote for a long time without speaking. What she wrote, and what would later form the core of a paper that 17 academic institutions would argue about for a decade, was this: the cubs were developing faster than any cubs she had studied in captivity or monitored in the wild. Problem-solving, vocal mimicry, environmental mapping. The consistency of the environment, the absence of threat signals. The presence of a calm and constant adult figure had created conditions that were, in developmental terms, nearly ideal. Rail did not know any of this. He was not thinking about developmental conditions. He was thinking about whether the protein mix needed more fat content, because Sara had been eating less this morning, and he wanted to figure out why before it became a problem. He asked Irvine about it. She blinked. Then she told him. He adjusted the mix that afternoon. Sara ate well at the next feeding. He noted it in the small log he had started keeping, the same way he kept maintenance logs for the ship, because it seemed like the kind of thing worth tracking. In the observation record, Yavin noted, subject appears entirely unaware that he is doing something unprecedented. He appears to believe he is doing something obvious. She underlined it twice. She did not know yet what to do with that either, but she was beginning to suspect it was the most important sentence in the entire file. Every species on Dural Point felt the warship arrive before they saw it. It was not a sound. Sound did not travel through vacuum. It was something older than sound. The station's structural sensors registered the gravitational displacement first, then the proximity alerts, then the long, low vibration that moved through the station's hull and into the floors and up through the boots of every being standing anywhere on Dural Point. The Veth warship's sovereign Fong came out of faster than light, travel at a distance that was technically within safe range and practically a statement. It was 4 times the length of the entire station. It moved into docking position with the slow patience of something that had never once in its existence needed to hurry. Dural Point went quiet in the way that things go quiet when something very large reminds everything smaller that it exists. Bryn appeared in the doorway of the crew quarters. "There is a warship," she said. "I heard," Rail said. He was replacing the protein mix in the feeding tray. Sarah watched him do it with the focused attention she gave to anything involving food. "A Veth warship." "I assumed." "Rail, it is enormous." "Bryn," he said, in the same tone she had heard him use when a cargo loader was stuck and he was working through the problem. In order. It was going to happen eventually. They were always going to come for them. She leaned against the frame. "Are you nervous?" He thought about it. "A little," he admitted. "But that's normal." "That's fine." The request for a direct meeting came through official channels. 40 minutes later. Not a demand. A request. Rail read it twice and said yes. The meeting was set in a neutral bay, station side, midpoint, between the steady hand and the Sovereign Fong's docking collar. Rail asked that Bryn stay with the Cubs. He asked it as a practical matter, because the Cubs needed someone, not because he was staging anything. Bryn understood this. She sat down in the crew quarters with the expression of someone making peace with an unusual afternoon. High Commander Vareth entered the neutral bay alone. Rail had looked up the rank before the meeting. It was the equivalent of someone who commanded an entire fleet sector. It was not a rank that came personally to collect 2 Cubs from a cargo hauler. It was a rank that sent people. Vareth had come herself. She was large, not in the way that Skarath was large, which was the largeness of an individual built for it. She was large the way that authority is large, the sense that the space around her had already agreed to step back. Her scales were deep gray fading to black at the edges, and across her left arm ran old scars that were not accidents. Her eyes were the dark amber of something that had seen a great deal and processed all of it and continued moving. She looked at Rail. He looked back. "You are Rail Dorn," she said. Her galactic comment was exact. The kind of exact that came from choosing it deliberately. "Yes," he said. "You found the Cubs of the diplomatic courier-honored path." "Yes." "You will be compensated for the retrieval service," she said. "We will arrange transfer of the Cubs to Dominion Care today. Your record will reflect a formal commendation." It was a clean, complete offer. It left no room for complication. "I appreciate that," Rail said. "I want to make sure the transfer is done carefully." The larger one, Sarah, she gets aggressive when she feels a change coming. The smaller one adjusts faster. But he needs a settling period, about 2 hours, in a new space, before he's comfortable. Vareth looked at him for a moment. "You have named them." "Working names," he said, "so I could tell them apart in my log." "You kept a log. Feeding times, behavior patterns, what worked and what didn't." "I can send it to Dr. Orvine." She seemed like she'd want it. Vareth was quiet. Not the quiet of someone with nothing to say. The quiet of someone recalibrating. Then the sound came from the corridor. The small access hatch at the side of the bay, which had been sealed, was not sealed anymore. It was open, and through it came Sarah, and then Den, moving at the low, quick pace they used when they were going somewhere specific. They went to Rail. They sat at his feet. Sarah pressed against his left leg. Den made the 2-syllable sound. Rail put a hand briefly on each of their heads and said, quietly, "How did you 2 get here?" It was not entirely a question. Vareth had not moved. Her expression had done something that Rail did not have enough knowledge of Veth faces to read, but Yavin, watching through the observation feed, would later describe it in her log as the first genuine emotion the High Commander had shown since arriving. "The hatch was sealed," Vareth said. "They figured those out on day 2, Rail said. "I started clipping them after that, but Bryn must have missed this one." "Day 2, Vareth repeated slowly. "Is that unusual?" She did not answer that directly. She looked at the Cubs. They were watching her the way cubs watched an unfamiliar Veth. Aware, assessing, not hostile, but not moving toward her. She lowered herself, slowly, to a crouch. She made a sound, a Veth sound, low and resonant, the kind that carried authority. Sara's tail moved once. An acknowledgement. Then she leaned, harder against Rael's leg. Vareth straightened. She looked at Rael with an expression that he would think about for a long time afterward. You may not understand what you have done, she said. I didn't want them to be scared, he said. That's all it was. The silence after that was a long one. Neither of them filled it. Outside the observation window, Yavin had stopped writing and was simply watching. Down the corridor, Bryn had appeared and was also watching, and she looked like someone who had just understood a thing she had not had words for before. The cubs did not move from Rael's feet. There is a particular kind of meeting that the Galactic Council holds when something has happened that does not fit any existing category. It is not called an emergency session on the official schedule. It is listed as an unclassified event review, which sounds like paperwork and is designed to, because the council has found over its long history that calling something an emergency before you understand it tends to make it one. The session convened at the central chambers on the Mirren home station. Yavin attended in person. Orvine attended via long-range link from her research vessel. Skarath submitted a written statement and refused the invitation to speak, which everyone noted and no one mentioned aloud. Yavin read her report first. She read it in the flat, careful voice of someone who has spent a long time making sure the facts were in order because she was worried that if they were not perfectly in order, no one would believe them. The council chamber was quiet throughout. The kind of quiet that is not absence of response, but presence of attention. She described Rael Dorn, cargo hauler, 11 years in the outer reach, no prior diplomatic record, no xenobiology training, no formal first contact qualifications of any kind. She described the signal he had stopped for, which no protocol required him to stop for. She described the pod, the cubs, the bites he had taken, and the way he had responded to them. She described 6 days of care, detailed in a log that she appended to the report, a log that was written in the same shorthand style as his cargo maintenance records because to Rael Dorn there did not appear to be a meaningful difference between the two. When she finished, there was a long pause. Then a representative of the Dalver species, who communicated through a translation device clipped to his anterior gill plates, said he kept feeding logs. Yes, Yavin said. Like livestock. More like. Yavin paused. More like someone who was responsible for something and took that responsibility seriously. The log covers behavior patterns, physical health markers, sleep cycles, and notes on what reduced distress most effectively. Another pause. A Mirren council member, older than Yavin by several decades and with the particular stillness of someone who had been in too many meetings to spend energy on visible reactions, said, the Veth. Response. Walk us through it again. The cubs responded to his absence of fear, Yavin said. Dr. Orvine's analysis is appended. The short version is that Veth cub threat response is triggered by fear signals in the environment. If the environment does not produce fear signals, the threat response does not activate. Mr. Dorn did not produce fear signals. He wasn't afraid. The Dalver representative asked. He said he was more worried about them than about what they were. The council member who had been sitting still finally moved. He folded his hands and said, We have had 300 years of Veth diplomatic difficulty, trade disputes, territory, incidents, 2 near conflicts in the outer systems. 300 years of very careful management of the distance between Veth, space, and everyone else. Yes, Yavin said. And what you are telling this council is that a cargo pilot accidentally did something in 6 days that 300 years of diplomatic effort did not. I am not drawing that conclusion formally, Yavin said carefully. What I am saying is that the behavioral data suggests the difficulty may not have been inevitable, that the pattern of Veth to other species interaction, specifically the escalation cycle, may have been sustained on both sides. The chamber was quiet again. Orvine's image, small and slightly delayed on the link, said, I can confirm from the behavioral side. The cubs should not have responded the way they did. The fact that they did suggests the threat response is conditional, not fixed. We have been treating it as fixed for 3 centuries. Nobody said what that meant. They all understood it. What it meant was this. Every species in the galaxy, for 300 years, had seen the Veth and been afraid, and the Veth had seen the fear and read it as threat, and had responded to the threat, and everyone had responded to that response, and the loop had run so long that everyone had stopped looking for the place where you could simply step out of it. Rail Dorn had stepped out of it by not knowing it was there, or by not caring, or by caring more about 2 small frightened creatures than about the 300 years of careful management that said he should not touch them. Outside the chamber, on the wider network, the footage had now reached beyond the outer reach. It had reached core systems. It had reached the Veth Dominion itself, where it was being watched in silence by people who had very complicated feelings about what it meant. Scaratha's leaked statement had circulated everywhere. He had not made it to be leaked. He had made it because someone had asked him directly, and he had answered honestly and apparently forgot that honest answers travel. He said he was not afraid of them, so they were not afraid of him. I do not know what to do with this. The line had been repeated so many times that it was starting to appear in comment threads and languages Scarath had never spoken in his life. Rail, on the steady hand, still docked at Dural Point, did not know the scope of what was spreading across the network. Bryn had tried to show him twice, and he had looked for about 30 seconds, and then said he needed to check the fuel cell calibration, and gone to do that instead. A journalist from one of the core system feeds had reached Dural Point by the 5th day and found Rail eating a late meal in the crew lounge, alone, because Bryn had gone to resupply. The journalist asked him what he had been thinking when he reached into that pod. Rail ate a bite of his meal. He thought about it the way he thought about everything, like the question deserved an honest answer even if the honest answer was small. They were making a sound I didn't like, he said. I didn't think past that. The journalist waited for more. That was all there was. The journalist left and wrote an article that opened with that quote and was shared across 14 systems in 6 hours. Not because it was dramatic, because it was the opposite. Because, in a galaxy that had built 300 years of very elaborate and very careful structures around how terrifying the Veth were, the simplest man in the story had looked at 2 of them and thought, I don't like that sound. I should fix that. And then he fixed it. 7 years is not a long time for most things. For a star, it is nothing. For a trade dispute, it is a middle chapter. For diplomatic progress between species that have spent 3 centuries learning to be afraid of each other, 7 years is fast, uncomfortably fast, some said, the kind of fast that makes older diplomats nervous because in their experience things that moved fast tended to also fall fast, and 3 centuries was a long way down. But it was moving. The OpenReach station had taken 4 years to build, which was a record for any joint species construction project, which was itself because 3 of the 5 species involved had simply agreed to stay out of each other's way and let each work on their own sections, which had produced a station that looked unusual from the outside and worked extremely well on the inside. The Veth section was precise and slightly cold. The Mirren section had better lighting than anywhere else. The human section had a lounge with comfortable chairs and a food processor with an unreasonable number of options, which everyone used regardless of what section they were from. The first joint diplomatic summit in 300 years was held there. Rail had not been told he was coming until 4 months before. It happened when he received a formal message from High Commander Vareth, personal address, not official channels. It said very simply that his attendance was requested in a personal and informal capacity. It said that the Cubs had asked for him. He read it twice. He showed it to Bryn. She read it twice. Then she told him she was coming too and that this was not a discussion. He had not argued. He dressed the same way he always dressed, which was in clean, practical clothes that had no diplomatic significance whatsoever. Bryn had suggested that he consider something more formal. He had thought about it, and then put on what he was going to put on anyway, and she had sighed and let it go. The summit hall was large. It was full of beings and the kind a formal where that represented centuries of cultural tradition, and the significant expense of travel from multiple star systems. There were cameras. There were observers in elevated sections. With recording equipment, there were translation units placed. At every table, each one calibrated for 17 languages. Rail stood near the entrance and felt slightly out of place, in the way that he always felt slightly out of place in rooms where people knew they were participating in history. He was looking at the room when Bryn touched his arm. He turned. They were taller than he had expected. That was the first thing. He knew, intellectually, that 7 years was a long time for a species that matured faster than humans. He knew that cubs grew, but knowing it and seeing it were different things. Sarah was nearly his height, her scales now a deep blue-green that caught the hall's light in a way that looked almost metallic. Den was slightly shorter, the pale green of his scales marked along the spine with a pattern that had not been there when he was small. They wore the formal sash of junior Veth ambassadorial representatives, dark red edged in silver. They were formidable. That was the word for it. Standing in the entrance of that hall in their formal wear, speaking to a Mirren coordinator beside them, they were what they had always been going to be, the kind of beings that cleared space around them without asking for it. Sarah saw him first. He could not read a Veth adult face the way he had learned, a little, to read the faces of cubs. But whatever the expression was that moved across Sarah's face in that moment, it was not subtle. Den turned to follow her gaze. The room noticed because rooms like this one are full of people whose entire job is to notice things. They crossed the hall toward him. Not fast, not slow. The way that something walks when it does not need to signal anything, because the fact of it walking is already the whole signal. They stopped in front of him. He looked up at Sarah. She looked down at him. The last time he had seen those eyes, they had been cub enormous in a small face. They were larger now, set in a face that was all planes and angles. And they were the same gold they had always been. Sarah lowered her head until her forehead pressed briefly, gently, against his shoulder. Den did the same on his other side. The hall was very, very quiet. Rail put a hand on each of their heads, the same way he had when they were small enough to carry 2 hands, one on each. A brief and steady pressure. He said something to them that no microphone in the hall was close enough to catch. Den lifted his head. His galactic comment was clear and precise, and carried the faint shape of a regional accent that belonged to the outer reach, learned long ago from a cargo pilot who had not known he was teaching it. "We know," Den said. The summit began. It did not go perfectly. Diplomacy rarely does. There were 2 moments in the afternoon session where the translation units flagged a misunderstanding and the whole room had to stop and recalibrate. There was one point where a Dalver representative said something that a Veth delegate took as a territorial implication that was not intended, and the room held its breath for several seconds before Sarah, quietly, offered a reframe that made it possible to move forward. But nobody walked out. No one left the table. For the first time in 300 years, a meeting between the Veth Dominion and the Galactic Council reached its scheduled end without fracturing. Afterward, Rail found a small observation lounge off the main hall and sat there in a chair that was very comfortable, which he suspected was the human design section of the station, and watched the stars through the viewport. Bryn found him there, after a while, and sat in the chair next to him without preamble. They were quiet for a time. "Did you think it would be like this?" she asked eventually. He was quiet a bit longer. Outside, the stars moved with the slow drift of the station's rotation. "They were just cubs," he said. Bryn looked at him. Then she looked out at the stars. "Yeah," she said. "That's what I thought." Down the hall, in a room full of beings in formal wear from 6 species, Sarah and Den were talking to a circle of young diplomats who had never been in the same room as a Veth before. The young diplomats were nervous. They were handling it well, but the nervousness was there. Sarah said something, low and direct, and Den said something after it, and whatever they said, the nervous diplomats laughed. Not the careful, polite laugh of people managing discomfort. The real kind. In the observation lounge, Rail did not see this. He was watching the stars, but Bryn, glancing through the corridor window, saw it, and she did not say anything. because some things did not need to be said. They sat there for a while longer. Outside, the galaxy turned. Inside, slowly, carefully, something in it was beginning to change.